All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out on a Monday. We had a lot of debate in the office whether or not we should do this in the morning or after lunch, and we thought, well, on a Monday, after lunch makes the most sense. It's great to see you all in person, and hello to everybody joining us online. This is the Korea Economic Institutes of America exclusive event called Siloed No More, the U.S. ROK Alliance and a Taiwan Conflict. I will let the panelists sort of explain what the report is about, because I think it's really, really quite timely, really, really thoughtful, and really well put together. So let's get to the panelists. First, my name is Arias Dare. I'm the Director of Communications here at KEI. Hopefully I will be doing as little of the talking as possible because you are here to see these two. Left is Dr. Clint Work. Clint is a fellow and director of academic affairs at the Korea Economic Institute of America. That's here. In addition to his work on KEI's publications and publication-related programs, Clint leads KEI's university outreach, conducts research, writing, and public engagement focused on U.S.-Korea relations. He's also served as a fellow in the Henry L. Stimson Center's 38 North program. I believe we have somebody from 38 North here, where he focused on issues related to the U.S. ROK Alliance transformation, led congressional engagement about peace and security on the Korean Peninsula, and a slew of other accomplishments. He is also a terrific friend and colleague. Welcome, Clint.
Thanks for having me.
Next, we have Alexis Turek. Alexis is the team lead for the Coalition Defense of Taiwan project. Now, this is a joint effort between the American Enterprise Institute and the Institute for the Study of War, examining alternative defense strategies for the U.S. and its allies in the Indo-Pacific, and publishing weekly updates on PRC coercion throughout the region. Alexis's research interests include the People's Liberation Army, Taiwanese domestic politics, and Southeast Asia. She received a master's degree in diplomacy and international relations from Seton Hall University. Her work has been published in a number of outlets, including The Diplomat and East Asia Forum. And while I cannot independently verify whether or not she is also a terrific colleague, her coworkers, some of who are in the audience today, confirm that indeed she is. Welcome, Alexis. So I wanted to start this conversation with something that I wish people would always ask me when I'm presenting research or stuff that I've written, or just something that I've read before. What's your report about, Clint?
Sure. First things first, I want to give thanks to all my KEI colleagues. I am the sole author of the report, but a report and a project of this sort, of course, is very much a team effort. So I've acknowledged this in detail in the report, but I just wanted to make sure I said that, and to thank KEI's president and CEO, Scott Snyder, who's been very supportive of this effort since the day he joined us on April 1st of last year, which is almost a year. I can't believe it. So what is the report about? Sort of top line, broadly speaking, it's about how and to what extent or whether the U.S.-South Korea Alliance is prepared for how it's oriented toward a potential conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. And just by way of a little bit of background, it builds on and was motivated by a paper that I wrote for KEI's flagship journal, Korea Policy, titled Rhetoric versus Reality, Seoul and Washington's Strategic Alignment in Taiwan. And in that paper, I traced what I think a lot of alliance watchers were watching at the time, which was sort of this emergent language in bilateral statements about the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And this was not just in the U.S.-South Korea Alliance context. It was in many, with many U.S. allies and partners. And this really did represent a sort of diplomatic sea change in signaling. It was notable. And I traced this from the first mention in May of 2021 under the Moon Jae-in administration, and as it continued under the Yoon administration, and really expanded under the Yoon administration to the point of their own unilateral statements, maybe most notably in their own Indo-Pacific strategy report, where they directly linked the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait with the same on the Korean Peninsula, which was sort of an inversion of a linkage. Historically, they talked about the importance of peace and stability in the Korean Peninsula to the region, but that reverse linkage was notable. But in the process of researching for this paper, Arias, it became clear to me, as the title of my paper indicated, that there was a gap between this notable and important language and the actual sort of level of detailed conversations or scenario planning in an alliance context about how they actually would navigate a conflict. So what I set out to do was conduct dozens of interviews, primarily with South Korean and U.S. Counterparts, both then current and former government employees, think tank experts, and academics, both here and in Seoul, and conducted about 42 total interviews in an effort to sort of get behind or underneath this rhetoric and see their reflections on how this language had evolved, to what extent there actually were any conversations about a conflict, what challenges or obstacles there might be to having those conversations, and also what the sort of key dynamics or variables the alliance would have to consider or navigate in the event that a conflict touched off around Taiwan first, and things were ostensibly stable in the Korean Peninsula.
These interviews were conducted recently, during the pandemic?
Good question. So I conducted them largely from June of last year to February of this year.
Okay, so this is current. Many of these people would be bending the ears of policymakers currently in Washington and Seoul, or perhaps part of these respective administrations.
Yes.
And what sort of things did they have to say? How is the evolution of the current state of U.S. ROK Alliance signaling on Taiwan? What are the discussions about a Taiwan conflict or contingency?
Sure. So as I had some of my premises or assumptions confirmed and sort of corroborated, but just top line. First, many of the respondents brought up the same evolution in language that I was talking about, and what they highlighted really across interviews, and there was variance in this, but one thing most respondents stressed was that Seoul's shift was less about Taiwan or any sort of ostensible commitment that the South Korean government was ready or willing to make in the event of a conflict, and it was more about Korea-centric and intra-alliance factors that drove the change in discourse. And under the Moon administration, this revolved around trying to garner more U.S. support to re-engage or restart negotiations with North Korea, which had become sort of stalemated at that time. And under the Yoon administration, it was really more about sort of intra-alliance bargaining, if you will, but to garner a firmer U.S. commitment, U.S. extended deterrence commitment, which we saw, of course, manifest in the Washington Declaration and the establishment of the NCG. But it was in that context that they really adopted this language and, as I said, expanded it. And so that being the case, that being the key drivers behind this shift in language, when I asked, so where do discussions stand? What is the level of discussion? Are they having official sort of detailed discussions in an alliance context?
They specifically the U.S. and South Korea at different levels of government.
Yes. And so the consensus response was any conversations were at a very, very nascent stage. Quite a few respondents outrightly said there are none, that they're non-existent, they're not having any. Others admitted, that there may be more robust conversations than we're aware of, and we can't say for sure. But the overriding sentiment was that there's probably a lack of really detailed discussion about different scenarios and how the alliance would respond in the event that a conflict touched off in Korea. And that when the issue was raised, the sort of visceral Korean response was to redirect the focus to how North Korea might exploit the situation to its advantage, either opportunistically aggressing or just the focus needed to remain on the peninsula. Mm-hmm. And also concern about how it might affect USFK's potential deployment to a Taiwan conflict. So again, there was more conversation, but it was and a recognition that, of course, these are interconnected, but focused very much still on the Korean Peninsula.
Alexis, do these research findings does this mesh with CDOT's understanding of the conversations that the U.S. is having with its Indo-Pacific partners in regards to a Taiwan contingency? Or does this really come out of left field? Was this surprising to hear, for example?
would say that this broadly aligns with what we're seeing within our research at CDOT. I did not realize the extent to which there was not any sort of conversation, but one major issue that we have identified is that there does not seem to be any sort of conversation, not just between the US and South Korea, with the US and really any allies, about what role any sort of ally should play in a Taiwan contingency. Broadly, this seems to be that no one either wants to make these sort of determinations now. There's a lot of worry about provoking China or seeing as something that's moving us closer towards war. But in general, I think we're seeing this lack of preparation seems to really be hurting a lot of the US alliances.
Just one sort of footstop point. I do want to highlight that in my research, and I cite a lot of this in the work, there is much more open source analysis and commentary and even reports that are grappling with the interconnections between Korea and Taiwan. There are authors of some of that work in the room here. So there is some conversation happening, but I didn't get the sense. I'm trying to draw the distinction between that sort of work and then to what degree they're really hammering away at some of the details and the different roles and responsibilities, division of labor and dilemmas that they would face in the event in an official alliance context.
Clint, she mentioned a few of the obstacles already, but could you be a little bit more specific? So what are the challenges and the obstacles that these respondents have told you on both sides of the Pacific that are preventing these difficult but perhaps necessary conversations from occurring?
Sure. So for those who are intrepid enough to read the whole report, it's very long. I get into details on all of these.
It's out now on our website. I'll send it.
That's right. It's dropped as we speak. I will say a shorter version dropped last week. So for the less intrepid of you, there's a shorter version that already exists. I won't go into all of them. I'll just touch a few that I think they're all important, these challenges or obstacles, and some of them rear their head at different times in different ways. One, I think, notable piece was, as I titled the section, Muddled and Misguided Assumptions about Allied Involvement. There was, across respondents, there was this assumption, of course, that the Japanese, that the Filipinos, that the Aussies would be more directly involved, and an assumption among some of the ROK respondents that these conversations were further along in these alliance contexts. On the one hand, I got the sense that from my many conversations that this may be disincentivized to a degree, Seoul's willingness to sort of to lean into this because others sort of had it. I also detected from some conversations that on the U.S. side of it was we can't really expect much from the South Koreans, that they have the response that I've already outlined, and that they're not the alliance partner that we can really depend on for this. But also a feeling that these assumptions really need to be critically interrogated, to the extent that maybe some conversations are further along than we expect, or if they're not, we need to start to grapple in other alliance contexts, to Alexis's point, why they're not, what are the sticking points, and how can we start to have more transparent within alliance contexts conversations, sensitive to how we signal this externally, of course, but how can we move this forward? Also, just in response to that point, the sort of misguided assumptions, some respondents on the U.S. side actually talked about, despite the expectations that Japan would be more directly involved for a host of obvious reasons that I run through in the report, that actually the U.S. ROK Alliance is the bones of the alliance. The consultative architecture, the degree to which the combinedness of the two militaries and the degree to which they work together is actually more operationally prepared for a conflict or a crisis, obviously focused on the Korean Peninsula, but that could theoretically be retooled for other purposes as well. And again, and I get more detail on that in the report. Another challenge, Arius, is the complexity of South Korean views toward China. So ROK respondents all noted that they, and everybody else has been observing the really growing bipartisan consensus in Washington, D.C. on U.S.-China strategic competition, but that there was nowhere near that consensus within South Korea. There was a broad understanding that China was a challenge and that would probably increasingly be so, but that there was not a shared threat perception or view of China as an adversary to anywhere near the same extent. everyone was aware of and often cited increasingly negative sentiments within South Korea towards China, but that this itself, this polling, doesn't necessarily indicate a view of China as a threat or an adversary. And obviously the fact, and we've seen this become more amplified in the context after President Yoon's martial law declaration and impeachment, how views on China are inextricably bound up with and highly politicized in South Korea's own partisan domestic politics. Though there was, and that's the final point I'll make about the complexity of views towards China, there was also a sentiment, though, that the sort of oversimplified view of conservatives in South Korea and progressives in South Korea's view does more to muddle people's understanding of Korea's positioning on this, that there actually are quite a lot of not significant numbers of progressives that very much view China as a challenge, don't doubt that it will increasingly be one, some of them bordering on a potential threat, but that they have different preferences for the right way to approach it. So that's something that actually I would like to dig more into. And then the last thing I'll say, I know I said I'd mention just a few of them, was there was sort of this lingering uncertainty or ignorance about the relationship between South Korea and Taiwan itself. It's well known, the economic linkages and how critical the sea lanes of communication are, and if any blockade or conflict scenario would immediately and maybe overwhelmingly affect South Korea's economy. Just setting aside any consideration of North Korea's opportunistic aggression or how the alliance would navigate this, just economically speaking. People are, of course, aware of this, South Korean firms, of course, as well, but that there was a lack of, that there was still a widespread ignorance among the Korean public and even some political leaders about this, and that there needed to be more sort of neutral education just about how many economic costs that South Korea would face in the event of a conflict. There was also in line with this relationship or lack of ties, some doubted the Taiwanese people. Did they have the will to fight like the Ukrainians have demonstrated? Do they actually expect there to be a conflict? Some of the South Koreans raised these questions, but then the sort of cooperation that would be necessary to shed light on these, sort of answer these questions, they were reticent to engage in because it would spark China's ire. And I get into some detail about that and some Taiwanese respondents' view of that as well. And also, last point, a set of even
Is this the last one?
It is the last point. A set of lingering even competition between Taipei and Seoul, because understood that the U.S. commitment is going to be spread thin one way or the other. And so rather than seeing themselves as sort of holistically interconnected as part of in a larger regional security architecture, there was some view expressed that Taiwan's misfortune might even be to South Korea's benefit.
So, Alexis, you said that broader sort of alliance management and alliance signaling, it extends not just to Korea, but also for other partners in the Indo-Pacific, specifically when it comes to a Taiwan contingency. Mm-hmm. So, more broadly, when we're talking about working with U.S. allies, what do you think are the most important variables or dynamics that these alliances would have to consider or navigate in the event of such a conflict?
I would say one of the foundational issues that we have found when we're trying to look at forming a coalition to defend Taiwan, because we believe that Taiwan is willing to defend itself. However, the overwhelming military power of China is something that Taiwan cannot take on alone. So we do believe that some sort of coalition of the US, Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines will all need to collectively work together. Like you said, that's easier said than done. One of the major issues that you found is, number one, countries do not want to risk any sort of economic relation with China. China is fully aware that they can inflict a lot of pain on a lot of these countries. It's an important messaging tool for them. It's also an important tool of economic coercion for them. However, one thing that we've realized is that trying to acquiesce to any of China's demands don't actually lead to any sort of lessening in tensions. We've often actually seen it increase tensions along the Taiwan Strait. By simply allowing China to do whatever it will, it can then gradually change the status quo in and of itself. One other really important thing is simply the US messaging. So one major issue that in our report that we released last year, we looked at a short of war coercion situation. So not actually an invasion, we did sort of a quasi-blockade with really intensified military activity around Taiwan, as well as just attempting to further isolate Taiwan. And one thing that we identified was that without any sort of very firm U.S. commitments, any of the U.S.'s allies are going to be very reticent to come to Taiwan's aid alone. So if the United States cannot make it clear that they are coming to Taiwan's aid, and they cannot make it clear exactly how they are going to come to Taiwan's aid, then it's very unlikely that any other state is going to do that independently. And even if they are, it's unlikely that they will be able to also take on China alone. So I think the U.S.'s role is paramount whenever we're talking about any sort of cross-strait contingency.
She keeps sparking thoughts and opportunities to hit other points I didn't hit. But just that last point, one of the other challenges or obstacles was Washington's own mixed messaging on this. Obviously, we have a policy deliberately crafted of strategic ambiguity. Some said that because of this and the mixed signals that we will defend, and then walking these comments back, and then other expressions of skepticism about our ability even to defend if we wanted to, Taiwan, that is, has led to a reticence among the Koreans to engage, because if we don't know for sure what the U.S. is going to do, it's very hard for us to buy into this. There was also, I will say though, when I asked, and I asked every South Korean respondent this, what would you prefer the U.S. do in the event that China did aggress against Taiwan? A little more full scale than what you described as a conflict, but not full scale amphibious invasion. And every single respondent but one said that they expected they wanted the U.S. to intervene and that it must intervene. But then alongside that, there was a reticence to go too far in saying how they would support that, even though when I pushed on the point, the reason the U.S. had to intervene in their minds got back to core South Korean national interests. So there's a tension there, there's a dissonance there. Anyway, I'll stop there, otherwise I'll keep going.
I will say also your point about the perceived competition between Taiwan and South Korea within the U.S. interest was something that I thought was really fascinating and something that I had not considered at all. I would be willing to bet that a lot of other U.S. allies probably have really similar feelings of potentially a Japan-Taiwan competition of the U.S. interests. I think that that's something that the U.S. is really going to have to work on messaging to its allies, that this is not ranked in terms of your importance to the region, that every single country is a foundational part of maintaining Indo-Pacific security.
Yeah, she definitely alludes to what is hopefully my final question before the rest of you ask your inquiries. You know, that is one of the big takeaways here. If you had 30 seconds to basically synthesize your big picture takeaways, and you obviously have more than 30 seconds here, but how would you distill this in so many words?
Sure. Well, I mean, it really builds directly on what Alexis just said, and I titled this the make or break role of U.S. allies, that even with U.S. allied involvement and support, it will be a very difficult task to deter and successfully defend against China. Without that support or involvement, my feeling is that it's not possible, given the geography of the region and the need to be able to tap into and utilize the full scope of U.S. defense infrastructure and very likely U.S. allies' own national capacities. Again, U.S. defense infrastructure that is in the in the territory of our allies in the region. So you really just have to have allies in this. Another piece, like we've already been talking about, is that allied support is not guaranteed. I suppose there are no guarantees in life, but death and taxes. But you know, we need to, again, like I said, critically interrogate the level of commitment and what allies are willing to bring to bear. The piece on allied dissonance that I mentioned, I talked about this in the South Korean context, but I would assume there's probably some of this feeling or some of this dynamic elsewhere. Again, that this goes beyond just a U.S.-South Korea alliance issue. It's understandable, it's very understandable for the response in Seoul to be to immediately redirect, even if something touches off in Taiwan first, how we need to keep our eye on the prize on the Korean Peninsula. It makes complete sense. But these things are interconnected whether we like it or not. And so it doesn't matter how you feel about it and how much you want to avoid it. God forbid, in the event, they would be interconnected and quite rapidly so. But what that means, though, is it can't ultimately just be a U.S.-South Korea alliance discussion. I think there are some parts of it that are germane just to the bilateral context, for sure, but it would have to involve others. And the other big picture piece is this has to include dialogue with Taiwan. They are the people who are most directly vulnerable to and would most directly be affected by this sort of aggression. So an understanding of what they can bring to bear, what they need, how others can help support them is critical. And finally, and this might be the most important point, diplomacy has to come first. We have to be very careful in preparing for this. We don't, and this is a very difficult balance to strike, end up fostering the very security dilemmas and conflict scenarios that we're hoping to avoid. This is an age-old dilemma, right? It's not a new one. But this means we have to do our best, and China has a veto in this and has agency in this. But we have to do our best to maintain lines of communication with China, look for risk reduction measures, crisis communication. We need to make sure we develop and keep operating these lines of communication. And again, it's a two-way street. So it's one thing for us to push for it, but if there's not reciprocity, that poses a challenge. But those are the big picture.
Alexis, I feel like Clint sort of partially answered this, but my last question for you is, why does all this matter? I'm looking around the room, and a lot of us are very, very interested in the Korean Peninsula, but you're looking at this from a regional, perhaps even global perspective over at AEI. So how do you explain to people that the way that the U.S. ROK Alliance thinks about, conceptualizes, talks about a Taiwan contingency, why does that matter for broader U.S. foreign policy and security concerns?
Yeah. So I think number one, and most importantly, is that we do believe that the ROK will have some sort of important role to play with regards to Taiwanese security. So whether that's providing logistics, whether that's providing intelligence support, economic opportunities, diplomatic opportunities, the ROK is in a very, very, very important country with regards to Taiwanese defense in any sort of contingency. When you work in the Taiwan space, everyone has their own theory as to when an invasion might happen, what it's going to look like, what sort of indicators they're going to find. Nobody really knows what this invasion is going to look like or if it's even going to happen at all. But what we do know for a fact is that Chinese coercion against Taiwan is happening every single day. It's increasing, it's taking a variety of different forms, and we also know that Taiwan cannot hope to defend itself against any sort of invasion. It needs the assistance of the US and its allies. In addition, I think one very important aspect of any sort of US and ROK agreement, especially with regards to Taiwan, or any discussion with regards to Taiwan, is that this sends a very important message to the Taiwanese, but also to the PRC. To the Taiwanese, it sends that the US and the ROK are taking the situation very seriously, that they acknowledge that there is going to be an impact on their own security within South Korea if something happens on Taiwan. It also sends a message to the PRC that all of their information operations and attempts to isolate Taiwan are not working, that there are allies that are going to come to their aid, that there is a role for Taiwan to play in the Indo-Pacific, and that it's going to be defended by South Korea, by the US, by Japan, and other interested allies. Finally, I think it's very important for everyone to understand. I think while Taiwan is the core issue for the PRC, I think PRC rhetoric and actions indicate that they have broader goals. So I think it's very likely that any sort of Taiwan contingency is not going to be the end of any sort of PRC aggression. So while it is really important for the US and the ROK to start having these sorts of conversations around Taiwan, they absolutely cannot end with any sort of Taiwan scenario. That being able to facilitate these sort of dialogues sets a really important precedent right now that the US can carry on to all of its other alliances and to all other future conflicts.
Well said. Okay, well, I want to turn the floor over to our audience for any questions that you may have. For those of you watching the live stream, you can use the live chat feature to drop your question in there. First, Terrence.
Hi, Terrence Matsuo. I'm a non-resident fellow here at KEI, and I look forward to reading your work, Clint. I just had a question. So in Japan, Secretary Hegseth said that the U.S. would consider exercising and expanding access to terrain in Japan's southwest. And so I was wondering, based on your research, should we expect to see also, U.S. ROK military exercises in the region in order to kind of push back against China, or what kind of conditions would facilitate this kind of development? Thank you.
Sure, and Alexis, please feel free to weigh in on some of these questions. So what Secretary Hegseth highlighted, of course, is an ongoing trend. So it's, there may be ways they're going to ramp it up or add to it, but that's not a new thing, despite whether they'd want to admit that or not. Whether South Korea would be involved, so this is one thing I do touch on in the report is, South Korea is already involved in regional maritime security exercises, and they have been for years. What's interesting is how some of these exercises are signaled by how South Korea itself talks about and signals its involvement in them. And it's oftentimes, even though they're exercises that have clear regional security implications, they will oftentimes talk about them through a peninsular locus. So still with reference to the peninsula, even though it has application to maybe the Yellow Sea or the East China Sea. But to answer your question, what would, if I remember it correctly, Terrence, what would be the conditions to push it forward? Again, drawing on my respondents, one driver that people, both US and South Korean correspondents and others highlighted, was China's own behavior will likely continue to galvanize this sort of multilateral effort in the region. How the US conducts itself and leads or doesn't will be critical as well, and there were concerns about that. But if there is steady and consistent US leadership, if China continues to assert itself, I think that will provide, it's what has galvanized Japan to begin to reassess its own national security strategies, national defense strategy, its force posture. This is all related to China's behavior and a realization that they need to define their concept of defense more in terms of deterrence and not just a sort of narrow conception of defense, and through an actual threat assessment. In the scope of the U.S.-Japan alliance, those are still relatively new developments. In the post-Cold War era, but really in the last 15 years, it's really ramped up. Anyway, I'm being long-winded as I'm wont to be, so I'll stop there.
Marcus.
No, you're good.
Hey, thanks for this opportunity. This has been a spectacular conversation so far. Clint, I have spent a lot of time on this issue set, and we've talked about it on many occasions. And it strikes me one of the things that's missing from this conversation, and I haven't read the full report yet, so maybe it's addressed in your report, is how we get past this conversation of wanting to avoid the war and South Korea not wanting to get pulled into a conflict defending Taiwan, and to get down to the brass tacks of what a scenario would look like, and then leading to really two very difficult questions that I'm curious if you ran across answers to. Essentially, if you proceed from the premise that the U.S. Is willing to fight in the defense of Taiwan, that means that there is a conflict between the PRC and the United States. This is not about the defense of Taiwan at this point. This is about a broader mutual defense treaty between the ROK and the PRC. And so I find it difficult, the more that we tabletop exercise this and the more that we examine the hypotheticals, to imagine how the ROK-U.S. alliance survives if the United States is fighting a war with China and South Korea maintains some degree of neutrality, right? So how much South Korea supports the United States, I guess, is sort of a question. But it seems like we can't get to the conversation of, hey, this is a mutual defense treaty. So that's the first question. How does the alliance actually survive if the ROK does not become a co-belligerent? And then the second related question is, how does the appearance that might actually be possible not just end up realistically fueling the potential a collapse of deterrence, right? If the PRC believes that it could attack Taiwan, fight the U.S., but then South Korea remains a bystander and not a co-belligerent, then how is that not potentially creating the very scenario that South Korea wants to avoid this war, right? So those are two interrelated questions that I think getting past the sort of the pre-crisis scenario and what happens if this actually occurs. So curious to both your thoughts and Alexis' thoughts as well.
Yeah. How does not preparing and clearly not preparing actually galvanize the crisis itself?
Right. Yeah. That's the second question.
Yeah. I mean, the short answer is if I had answered those questions, I'd be floating above the ground. But that's part of what's motivated this, I think, as you know. So I did ask. I did premise all my interviews by providing a conflict scenario, which assumed the U.S. did intervene. It was a forcing function to try to galvanize the conversation. The feeling was, again, it would be a dance between some form of neutrality or South Korea would be supporting the U.S. And most respondents did say, in the event that the U.S. did come to Taiwan, most South Korean respondents did say that in the event U.S. did come to Taiwan's defense, South Korea would ultimately, for some of the reasons you mentioned, support the U.S. in one way or another. There was a distinct level of concern about being a co-belligerent, though, and being identified as such. And so, but to answer your question, so how do you get beyond that? I think a lot about the stickiness of alliance institutions and psychologies, and how it seems the more things change, the more they stay the same. And what are the moments in time where they have been shook up and more fundamental questions have been asked and there have been growing pains, but maturation. And it's usually when the U.S. forces the conversation, regardless of ROK sensitivities. Now, this sounds like me promoting this. I have like my own, I try to remain removed from outright promoting one way or the other as an analyst. But just reading the history, I mean, I'm thinking about the early 2000s when they had debates about strategic flexibility. And this is in the context of the Global Defense Posture Review and Richard Lawless and others, and obviously under Rumsfeld, really pushing for a sort of realigning the U.S. force posture in the peninsula and thinking about how it fits into extra-peninsular demands on U.S. resources and forces. I would argue that those conversations ultimately were sort of stillborn. They only got to a certain place. But my reading was that they were only had because U.S. defense authorities really pushed the issue and said, we have to have these conversations. So I think that would need to happen again, but there would need to be a sustained attention to really having those conversations. And part of it revolves around how, and I talk about this in the report, which you haven't seen yet, but misalignment on how they perceive the Mutual Defense Treaty and the letter and spirit of the obligations therein. And there's this myth, I would say, in Korea that this only applies to the Korean Peninsula. And nowhere in that treaty's text does it say that. It says quite the opposite. It talks about external aggression in the Pacific area. And so, and that's on areas under or later to come under, I'm paraphrasing, under the administrative control of either allied partner. That, to my reading, and I would need a lawyer and someone who knows treaty text better than I do, but that to me, commonsensically means U.S. defense infrastructure in Guam, in Australia, in Japan. Does it mean a U.S. ship? I don't know. But it means more than just U.S. bases and installations in the Korean Peninsula. On its face. That statement itself right there would garner pushback, a slew of editorials, and quite a debate. But if we're going to get past it, that's what we need to have. But it needs to be that. It needs to be open, public. Exactly. These are democracies. Yeah. Let's fight it out theoretically, not literally, but let's in the light of day, let's have this contestation of ideas and grapple with this. I will say though, Marcus, there was a sense that this is the direction things were going, and most ROK respondents understood that. Some of them were quite ready for it. Did I answer your second question? I can't even remember what it was.
You can call someone else.
So you answered kind of both of them together. Right?
Okay. Okay.
But yeah, the idea was the first question was about how does the alliance survive in the context of a U.S. PRC war if the ROK isn't clearly, living up to its mutual defense treaty obligations, and then how does that not fatally undermine deterrence if that perception exists?
Just quickly, promise. The other way of addressing that without sparking the security dilemma is there's such a slew of, and I think in some ways the alliance is already doing this, but working on logistics and sustainment operations in the region. They're already starting to do this. And this has many applications, some of which are in China's own interest, depending on what we're talking about, in responding to different types of natural disasters or humanitarian disasters. I think doing that now and showing that level, that interconnectedness and preparedness can have a deterrent effect all its own, especially if it's bringing in other allies and partners.
Sorry, can you grab his microphone and give it to Yeji?
Hi, Yeji Chung from AEI, Coalition Defense of Taiwan. There's a rising debate about nuclear armament in South Korea. If it happens, how do you see a shift in Taiwan topic discussion in South Korea as a result? To Clint.
So this is one thing that did come up repeatedly. I wasn't surprised by it in interviews with all my respondents, but particularly with South Korean respondents, was, well, if we have to take overwhelming responsibility for our own defense, especially in the context of a broader region with other contingencies, and if we have to contemplate even more than that U.S. forces on the pen, maybe leaving, we need to have our own nuclear weapons. And various respondents said that as not something they recommended or wanted, but that this was their analytical assessment of a sentiment that was growing, which I think we've all observed. Some of them were outright promoting the idea. The feeling was, though, across the board that this would, that the U.S. still needed to support this. So it was still an alliance. It wasn't like go our own way. It was still in an alliance context that this would have to move forward. All of which are all present their own dilemmas, and this would include the return of tactical nuclear weapons as well. That there would be obviously legal and treaty reassessments that would have to be involved in this, but that they would do it the right way, not like North Korea, that it would still be with U.S. support, that they thought the American people would understand this, and that it would also serve broader U.S. strategic interests. So again, there's an intra-alliance bargaining to this as well, which is always sort of there. That's the best answer I can give to your question. I don't know if generally, I should rephrase that, I don't think generally the feeling of we need our own nukes is so we can help out more for a Taiwan conflict, though. I don't think that's what's driving the sentiment in Korea. So adding that to the mix, it would really greatly complicate, I think, the debate. But maybe that's how you have that debate.
Yes.
Thank you. Dave Maxwell, and to echo Marcus, great conversation. Marcus asked my question, you partially answered it, but just to put a fine point on it, does the assumption that South Korea could remain neutral in any contingency protect South Korea? Does that continue to persist? And your answer said, no, there's growing realization. And along with that assumption, is there an assumption that if South Korea somehow doesn't allow strategic flexibility and U.S. forces in Korea be used for other contingencies, will that somehow protect Korea? And I think you've answered that, so I want to really move on to, do you find that those in South Korea have a sufficient understanding of U.S. forces Korea and the utility of its forces in a Taiwan contingency? Because, as we all know, they're optimized for the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, and very few of the forces have much utility in a Taiwan situation. And then for both Taiwan and Korea, and it's too soon because the administration's too new, and all most of your interviews took place before the administration came into power, but do we understand the the paradox, I think, with this new administration, does Taiwan and Korea understand that they cannot hope for U.S. support. They cannot make it public that they want to be rescued by the U.S. You know, what I'm saying is that the more that they commit to their own defense, the more likely they're able to get support from the U.S. and its allies. And whereas if they are not as committed, you know, and this goes, we can't want to defend Taiwan or Korea more than the Taiwan or Korean people want to. And I think that gets to, you know, everybody hopes to be bailed out by the U.S. And I think with the new administration, it's got to be that we'll defend ourselves first, and in so doing, the U.S. will be more willing to, you know, to come to their defense. Mutual defense treaty notwithstanding.
I might invite Alexis to have a first stab at this, because Alexis just returned from Taipei.
I did.
And there's actually specific conversations in the report about how Taipei is thinking about ROK involvement. So I was hoping you could just speak about what the Taiwanese might be thinking would happen along the lines with your question.
Yeah. First, to answer your question, I would say, yes, I did just get back from Taipei Friday night. We had a lot of conversations with various elements of the Taiwanese government and Taiwanese military. There is certainly an understanding that, particularly under this new administration, but also just in general, that Taiwan needs to provide for its own defense. It needs to communicate to the United States that it is willing to defend itself. It is currently is considering the best places to purchase new military equipment, various places to enhance its own existing capabilities. There is certainly an understanding of that. In terms of ROK involvement in a Taiwanese contingency, I have not heard high-level discussions about that. There definitely is discussion amongst some Taiwanese academics that they do believe that Korea will have some sort of involvement. It does seem to be not as a co-belligerent, but usually in the form of either diplomatic statements, coming in terms of economic assistance to Taiwan, providing some sort of intelligence sharing or logistics operations. But I have not seen any sort of widespread discussion about ROK having like boots on the ground in Taiwan, helping in any sort of anti-amphibious invasion operation.
Which sort of tracks with what your respondents were telling you, right, Clint?
It does. Yeah, so I would, just circling back to the first question, I think about USFK itself. That's one of my bugaboos, is you see it talked about, USFK strategic flexibility, and I think what a lot of this reporting and editorial commentary elides the actual brass tacks of the force structure itself and what it's postured for. And you know, there's some discussion of maybe some 7th Air Force units going, but it is not suited for anything but deterrence, and largely deterrence and defense on the peninsula. If you know, it came up that if there were large numbers of U.S. assets and forces being pulled from Korea, that means the conflict had metastasized. And so the question of U.S. strategic flexibility of U.S. forces, we've gone well beyond that issue, even from a Korean perspective. There's much more else that's going on. There still was a feeling, though, that we needed to revisit that earlier understanding, 2006 understanding on strategic flexibility, and talk about like under what circumstances would potentially U.S. FK assets need to be pulled, and for what purpose? How would we fill those gaps? But then I was really interested in, well, even if we came to a better understanding of that, it doesn't change the fact that USFK is currently constituted really isn't suited for this. So does that mean we have to think about reconstituting our force structure and posture on the peninsula to be able to handle its main mission, but also more readily contribute to off-peninsula issues? This raised what I expected it to, which was, you know, the feeling that, okay, well, this would mean that the South Koreans need to take on more than they have previously, maybe in fundamental new ways, i.e. nuclear weapons, this came up. But a concern that this would be a sign of a reduced U.S. commitment. You know, that it was that fear of both abandonment in it, but now we're getting entangled at the same time. But it just stands to reason that if the Korean Peninsula is going to get pulled in one way or another, it would behoove us, even from a South Korean perspective, to think through, maybe we should better think about how the U.S. posture here can achieve its central mission to our national security survival, but also be equipped to contribute elsewhere. If it's going to be, if demands will be put on it, it's better that it's actually suited for both, and we've exercised and gone through the paces on this.
Just kind of bridge Colby's argument.
And I didn't mention it yet, I'm happy you mentioned it, but his comments were hung over like a shadow over a lot of these conversations. They were referenced consistently. And I mentioned this in the report multiple times. I think, and Alexis, I agree with, I echo what she said initially to your question.
Thanks a lot, Clint, for this fantastic, for tackling this issue in this report. My name is Ben Sando, and I'm a research fellow at the Global Taiwan Institute. I was writing about, from the other side, about Korea's relations with Taiwan in December of last year, and anyone writing anything about Korea at that time suddenly maybe, was throwing their papers in the trash or something, because obviously, if there's a change in administration in Korea, and the likely, opposition candidate Lee Jae-myung is elected, the China policy of Korea could undergo revision to some extent, and that was really, I think, what was interesting for the Taiwanese was seeing the trilateral cooperation on maritime issues. That was probably the most tangible thing that the Taiwanese felt. So what is your expectation of, if Lee Jae-myung is elected, of Korean involvement, trilateral issues? Would you expect to see Koreans take part in trilateral maritime exercises with the Japanese maritime self-defense forces?
The South Koreans with the Japanese and the Taiwanese?
And the United States. So would you expect to see substantial maritime trilateral engagement under Lee Jae-myung?
I don't want to get out too far on my skis, because I don't, indicators to me that we can read right now are based on some of the advisors, some of Lee Jae-myung's own background, some of the differences between him and his predecessor, Moon Jae-in, and some of how he's subtly shifted some signaling on this idea of strategic autonomy outside the alliance, which is a sort of a regular policy line for progressive administrations. My read is that some of that's being tempered a little bit, which is not to say I don't think there will be a shift, because I think there will be, and this came out in a lot of the interviews, was when I talked about bureaucratic dynamics and shifts in ROK administrations, how this had a tempering effect on how far working level officials would be creative in their thinking, because they knew policy agenda was going to shift, and then if you went too far out under one administration, there would be a punitive reaction under the next. And ROK counterparts also talked about how they garnered this sentiment from other U.S. allies and partners in the region that were like, well, we see what you're doing now, but we're not entirely sure it's going to be sustained. I think there'll absolutely be a shift away. I think it would be foolish to think otherwise. The U.S. will play a role in this, but I do tend to think it may not be as marked as some might assume. I'm sure there are people who differ with me on that, but I'll leave it at that. Also, read Ben's report on ROK maritime responses to a blockade around Taiwan. It's a very good one.
Andy, we have a question online.
Right, thank you. We actually have a couple questions online, but I'll try to do a lightning round with an interest in time. So just two interrelated questions. We have one from Liam Quinn, who's asking, deterrence is the first prong of U.S. strategy. What is the ROK's role in contributing to deterring a PRC incursion? Is it solely messaging, or if there are capabilities they can prioritize? And related to that, General Chun In-bum asks, what type of support would be expected of South Korea in a Taiwan scenario?
I'll answer both those questions with one of, I think, the more valuable sections in the report, which is this idea of South Korea and the Korean Peninsula as a reconstituted and retrograde hub, which has to do with this idea of logistical and sustainment support. This is very complex depending on how long the conflict has been going on, to what level it's escalated. But if South Korean counterparts are not only willing to allow the U.S. use their own operated but not owned defense infrastructure in the region to the purposes they see fit, consulting all along, but also are willing to bring to bear South Korea's own considerable national capacities to help support and sustain an effort. I think that would probably be, this does not involve direct South Korean military involvement because, again, they understandably need to keep a focus closer to home, but allowing the Korean Peninsula to be more of a logistical rear area support sustainment hub. And again, not waiting for a crisis to ensue to have this tested, but to start to do things now that I think in the doing now would have an overall deterrent effect. And I want to give credit where it's due. I think this is already happening. I do believe it's already happening. But I'm not sure there's alignment on what some of the activities mean when viewed from the Pentagon per se and Korea. There might be sort of economic logics or advantages from a Korean perspective, but not necessarily fully grappling with what it means to prevail in a contested logistics environment, as DoD's regional sustainment framework would have it, which means prevail in a contest with China in a regional conflict, if I'm translating that. And I think that's an accurate translation. So I think that would answer the question. I hope that answers the question. And that's deterrence through preparedness.
I would say one addition in terms of deterrence as well does need to be messaging and just engagement between the ROK and Taiwan to the extent possible. Breaking any sort of PRC conceptions that Taiwan is this isolated island that nobody cares about, that nobody is willing to come to their defense. Anything that agrees with that sort of sentiment is to Taiwan's detriment. So having any sort of communication between the ROK and Taiwan, any sort of diplomatic engagement is going to be beneficial.
We have time for one more question. Yes, over here.
Hi, Kisa Jung. In your interviews, did you consider the potential for North Korean support for China? And if you did that change the thinking or the responses at all, especially among your ROK respondents, about whether in that case should South Korea now support United States if North Korea is supporting China? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We did not get into conversations of North Korean support for China similar to North Korea support for Russia and Ukraine, not that style. But it's its own very interesting question. Now I'm kicking myself for not having asked it, actually, so thanks a lot, Key. But we did talk about it in the context. It was almost assumed, as I think I've alluded to, that if something touched off around Taiwan first, that we face this huge risk of North Korea opportunistically aggressing either in some form of coordination with China or independently of it. And Marcus's work at the Atlantic Council explores these different pathways in great detail. There was an assumption that that was the greater risk. This did reinforce the clear reality that these are interconnected. And we can't avoid that. Some did raise actually doubts about this. One that North Korea itself would necessarily would be willing to do so. They might be more incentivized or interested to keep their powder dry, so to speak, and let things play out. After all, U.S. forces there'd be increased deployment to the region, so it might not be a situation in which North Korea would necessarily feel incentivized to rock the boat. Some also raised the question of whether or not China would actually want to encourage North Korea to aggress. We remember it was the Korean War itself that scuttled their plans and preference to settle things for good in the Chinese Civil War. So to have their effort, if things that's initiated around Taiwan, to push a conflict on the Korean Peninsula that affects their core national security interests as well and would draw their resources and attention, might undermine their ability to achieve their main objective. So there was some noted and I think rightful skepticism, alternative possibilities that people laid out.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming out. I think there are still some questions, so if you do, email all questions to cw@keia.org. That is Clint's line. And definitely make sure to check out future KEIA events at keia.org/events. Everybody who RSVP'd, you will be getting a PDF version of the full report. And as Clint mentioned, there is an abridged version already on our website. And make sure to also check out AEI's weekly update. Alexis has a big hand in putting that together every week, and that was actually quite useful as well for Clint's report as well. So, Clint and Alexis, thank you so much.